So welcome everybody to the second instalment of Sexualities and Histories of South Asia, a two-part series organised by the History Department at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. Today we are welcoming Associate Professor Ishita Pande and Professor Charu Gupta to talk about their brilliant research in this field. My name is Jessica Hinchy and I'm in the History Department here at NTU. And thank you so much, as always, to my colleague Tapsi Mata, who organises the fantastic NTU History Seminar Series and puts in a lot of hard work for all of these events. So in this series, we will be thinking about what it means to write histories of sexuality in South Asia. So how might histories of South Asia prompt us to rethink some of our concepts, and most of all the category of sexuality itself. Another question, of course, is whether the histories of South Asia that we're thinking about pose new questions for historians of sexuality who are working in other regions too. So we've asked all of our speakers in this series to respond to the question, how does your work invite us to think about sexuality in South Asian history? I could talk at length, extreme length, about the fascinating research of our speakers today, but I'm just going to pick out a few highlights to give you a sense of their biographies. So our first speaker is Associate Professor Ishita Pande of Queen's University in Ontario. Ishita's most recent book, Sex, Law and the Politics of Age, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2020. In addition to charting the history of the 1929 child marriage law, the book argues that age is neither a natural measure of all bodies nor a transparent category of analysis. I was quoting there. So Ishita's arguing that we need to historicise and theorise age like we do, for example, with gender. This path-breaking book draws on queer and feminist theory to unsettle both age and also the history of the sexual sciences in South Asia. And Ishita's earlier research examined the impact of colonial connections with India on race science in Britain, including in her 2010 book, Medicine, Race and Liberalism in British Bengal. Her talk today is titled The Sexuality of South Asian History. So our second speaker today is Professor Charu Gupta of the University of Delhi. Charu's 2002 book, Sexuality, Obscenity and Community, examined a fascinating and diverse archive of so-called low and high Hindi literature. And she showed how a homogenous Hindu community was constructed through a nexus of concerns around, as she put it, obscenity, sexuality, and the other in the late colonial period. Charu's brilliant second book, The Gender of Caste, was published with the University of Washington Press in 2018. And as its title so succinctly expressed, this book historicised and theorised the gender of caste. And it did this through an analysis of visual and textual representations of Dalits in Hindi print culture. So Charu's talk today is titled A Vernacular Archive of Sex and Sexuality. And just before we get to the papers, just some practical matters. So please do turn your mute on. We're going to have time for Q&A after the papers. So please feel free to ask questions in the chat as the speakers are speaking, or you can send them directly to me in the chat too. If you'd prefer to ask your question on camera, you can let me know, but if you would prefer me to ask your question, you can also just say that in the chat that you'd like me to ask it to the speakers. So without further ado, I invite our first speaker, Ishita Pande, to present her talk, The Sexuality of South Asian History. Thanks so much, Ishita.
Thanks so much, Jessica, for that introduction. And thanks also to you, Professor Tapsi Mathur, for this generous invitation to reflect on how my work invites one to think about the history of sexuality. In brief, the answer to the question is that my work invites you to see sexuality where it is not, or at least not explicitly present. And I say this, as Jessica just mentioned, my previous book was titled Medicine, Race, and Liberalism in British Bengal. And looking back at that book, I realized that at least half of that book is about bringing sexuality as a category of analysis into the understanding of colonial medicine. And it's something that I actually had not realized at the time that I'd actually written the book in the first place. And I've been sort of puzzling over that in my more recent work. Um, so in my more recent work, I think about the ways in which sexuality haunts so much of the scholarship on South Asia, even as sex and sexuality remain unnamed as the organizing principle for a lot of this scholarship. Hence the title of my presentation. In reflecting about the sexuality of South Asian history, I want to do three things today. To raise questions about how, until recently, sex remained an absent presence in South Asian historiography. Second, I want to reflect on what the sexuality of South Asian history might mean in opposition to, say, how sexuality is used in the context of, say, North American history or French history and so on. Third, I want to ask what the sexuality of South Asian might do to the history of sexuality as such as conceptualized within Euro-American fields, and how it might confront the lingering whiteness of the field of study. And this question about the whiteness of the history of sexuality is not something that is my critique at all, but it's something that is generated from within the field by several white scholars. I see my work as raising questions about historiography, in other words, about the portability or the translatability of sexuality as a category of analysis, and a stretching of the borders of the history of sexuality as such, as seen from the vantage point of South Asian history. And I will try to address each of these very quickly in turn. So the question of whether sexuality and even the physiological understanding of sex itself, whether these have a history, has been debated and perhaps even settled for several decades now. I think the question that interests me today is to think about whether history itself has a sexuality. In what ways do sex and sexuality organize our understanding of the discipline itself? In my recent book, Sex, Law, and the Politics of Age, which is on the surface a case study of the child marriage laws in India passed at the end of the 19th and the early 20th century. But it is also a historiographical essay, is how I describe it. And what I try to do in that book is think about the relationship between certain forms of sexual normativity and a particular way of thinking about time itself as homogeneous, empty, progressive, etc. And I do so mostly through a focus on chronological age, as Professor Hinchy mentioned. And in my book, I argue that if we theorize age as an embodied and sexualized unit of time, we begin to see how the very understanding of time that makes child marriage appear as a sexual scandal or a sexual abnormality also permeates historical accounts of the subject of child marriage. The phrase, the sexuality of history, echoes in part the work of Susan Lanzer. And because I don't have a PowerPoint, I just tend to wave books around when I'm trying to reference other scholars. So bear with me as I do that. But the way I use the term is to reflect on how the very concept of modern history turns on notions of time and space that rely on sexual normativity. It is to reflect on the ways in which sexuality both pervades and problematizes our understandings of historical methods, historical temporality, and historical archives. What would an acknowledgement that sexuality has a history, or that history rather has a sexuality, achieve? In the introduction to my book, I start reflecting on this question, and I suggest that sexuality is an absent presence in what is perhaps now the most celebrated post-colonial critique of historicism, and that's Dipesh Chakrabarty's Provincializing Europe. And I ask what might happen if he started to pay greater attention to the role that sexual activity plays in naturalizing history's time, about which, he writes and so many post-colonial scholars have written. Um, and again, reflecting back on some of the major scholarship produced by South Asian historians, what I do in my work is sort of cast a glance back to the scholarship on the census, for instance, by focusing on the individual or individuated enumerated category of age. And in doing so, I try to show how sexuality can help us reframe and rethink the vast scholarship on colonial power knowledge or colonialism and its forms of knowledge, to quote Bernard Cohn's title, an area of inquiry to which South Asian historians have contributed so much. Um, and this is something that Jessica, your work does incredibly well as well. And in relocating child marriage, perhaps perversely, in the field of the history of sexuality, by returning to the figure of the sexualized child as one of the four figures upon which modern sexuality is defined, um, as per Michel Foucault, I'm able to engage with the historiography on population and eugenics, on law and transnational governance, on the political arithmetic of majorities and minorities in late colonial India, all of which are understood in my book as fundamentally tied to discourses of sexuality. And when asked sometimes why I bothered to write a book on the Child Marriage Restraint Act of 1929, when such a brilliant book already exists, and I'm waving Amini Sinha's work around, I think my response to the question, tongue-in-cheek, of course, is I wanted to put sex back in that book. And that's what I really try to do in my book. My thinking on the absence of sex from titles of certain books, which are permeated otherwise by sexuality, is a thought generated by Professor Indrani Chatterjee's comments in the previous installment of this conversation as well, where Indrani suggested that she deliberately turned away from the use of the word sex in her title, and she refused to sex up her scholarship, even though we, as readers of her brilliant work, know how crucial her work is to thinking about sexuality in South Asia. So while we have in recent years read several books that do lead with sex, and I see some of you are here now. Well, of course, there's Jess's book, sorry, and we have Durba Ghosh's book, as well as Durba Mitra's book. I am also thinking of other books written by South Asian historians that are, again, sort of permeated by sexuality in a brilliant way, but they are not explicit about it. And I'm thinking about works such as Ritu Birla's work, for instance, where she writes about vernacular capitalism and centers gender in quite a brilliant way, especially in her later chapters. But she could also, I think, have centered sexuality, understood as gendered and generational control of intimate lives, as she writes about market governance and law. I'm thinking of Eleanor Newbegin's work, which offers powerful insights on the centrality of sex to the understanding and the organization of colonial law as such. So in broad terms, I want to reread South Asian historiography to ask what might happen if we were to go back and center sex. So in my own work too, I lead with the word sex because I want to tackle a peculiar historiographical phenomenon. Despite the vast scholarly writing on child marriages in India, very few works had actually treated the issue from the vantage point of the history of sexuality. In centering sex, I turned to queer theory to understand the new inflections to the child marriage question in the 20th century, when it became reconceptualized in sexological terms and as a new type of problem of intergenerational sex. But instead of simply adding queer theory to the mix, I wanted to make the historiographical point that I'm making now. While we have written feminist histories centering women's rights, social reform, imperial social formations, etc., In thinking about child marriage, while neglecting to tackle head-on the importance of sex and sexual regulation to the imagination of empire, the Indian nation, the Hindu nation, the secular nation, and so on. The history of sexuality offers a path, I find, to deculturalize the history of child marriage, but also at the same time, it allows us to talk back to the scholarship on intergenerational sex that is generated from other contexts by bringing to the table the uncomfortable example of child marriage and the figure of the child spouse to the conversation. So I'm interested in two seemingly contradictory exercises, bringing more capacious understandings of sex from South Asian history to stretch and exceed the borders of the history of sexuality, traditionally or Eurocentrically defined, but also to make sex a more explicit category of analysis for Indian history. I want to make sexuality something that belongs to and is therefore of South Asian history, and that's a project that I want to pursue in greater earnest with my new project, which is on the history of scientific and popular sexology in South Asia. Which tries to translate sexuality as a category of analysis in ways that are more meaningful for the writing of Indian history. Here, my early interest in the history of law and political theory comes in handy. To those well versed in post-colonial criticism or in feminist theory, it would come as no surprise that liberal political and juridical categories have over time come to stand in for our scholarly categories of analysis in the social sciences and humanities. Feminist critics have shown us how the agency we write of, the consent we value, the women's rights we historicize are all notions rooted in liberal juridical traditions and circumscribed by 18th and 19th century liberal and utilitarian thought. We know that the very concept of agency smuggles in the notion of the universality of the liberal notion of selfhood. It ignores vernacular idioms of being in and acting in the world. In my own work, I have taken these well-known critiques of liberal thought to scrutinize the attendant juridical notions of the relationship between age and agency. I show how the entwinement of age and agency traced to liberal political theory and the legal structures that gave rise to it in much of the formerly colonized world um, have led to sort of highly circumscribed ways of looking at agency, even in scholarly analysis. So the way I've tried to think agency beyond this way is to look at alternative juridical traditions and what I have described as a quest for the vernacularization of concepts such as agency, which is a twofold practice of finding equivalents for agency in other languages and idioms and cultures, but it also means revealing the parochial or provincial roots of the concept of agency with which we usually work. So the way I do that in my recent book, in the last chapter of the book, I turned to cases of Muslim child brides, for lack of a better term, who appeared in various high courts in India in the early 20th century. And instead of trying to read agency into their actions in courtrooms, where some of them defiantly left behind the men whom they had been married to by their parents, and without trying to unearth stories about consent or its lack, I foreground the principle of the option of puberty that permitted Muslim wives to exit marriages contracted for them in their childhood. As I clarify in my book, the intent is not to argue for the superiority of one legal structure or juridical concept over another, but to introduce new concepts and idioms as new categories of analysis. It is an attempt to look beyond agency, consent, pleasure, rights in our history of sexuality. And I'm going to just wave this book around that I cite incessantly in my book. It's Sabah Mahmood's Politics of Piety. To make sexuality something that belongs to and something that is organically of South Asian history, my current project is envisaged as a history of scientific and popular sexology, as I just described, and also a historiographical and theoretical exploration of the possibility of a history of sexuality for South Asia. So anticipating some of the questions I'm asking in an introduction to a recent special issue on the history of sexology, to which Charu contributed, and so did Durba, and I think I just saw her here. Um, I tackle the issue of the usefulness of sexuality as a category of analysis in Indian history. And I start by echoing Mini Sinha's questions on the portability of gender as a category of analysis, to ask what it means to extend a parochial, albeit familiar, understanding of sexuality to times and places other than those that gave rise to it in the first place. And I keep in mind Indrani Chatterjee's cautionary note that the process of naming something as sexual is, in a sense, a history of colonialism writ large. But I want to hold on to two thoughts at the same time, to retain the skepticism of using sexuality to describe phenomenon before sexuality, as it were, while also making sexuality an indigenous category of analysis. Thinking of sexuality as a problem of translation, I ask if sex means something in South Asia that cannot be captured within the contours of the history of sexuality that stem from another provincial history. And I end up suggesting that sex is indeed a useful category of analysis, and more so when we can root our understanding of sex and sexuality within Indian history itself. And I propose to do so by writing a history of sexology, by acknowledging that it is the scientific understanding of sex that came into being in the late 19th, early 20th century that circumscribes in many ways our use of sex as a category of analysis, while also tracing the history of sexology within India. So could a vernacular history of sexuality and gender, adding new figures beyond the four figures, Foucault's four figures, as described in the history of sexuality? Yes, it could mean that. And again, I'm going to wave another book around that tries to do that. But it could also mean writing histories that seem to defy the borders of this history. And this brings me to the third and final point about the sexuality of South Asian history and why it is important to center understandings of sex, sexuality, and the history from within South Asia. It is from the vantage point of South Asia that we can see how broad and unintuitive the harder borders of the history of sexuality are, where histories of rape, of abortion, of slavery, are considered to still sit uncomfortably. And I'm speaking of historiographies generated from within other fields of inquiry outside of South Asia. And while there is a thriving scholarship now on how sexual difference is articulated with racial difference by scholars working on, say, North America, the history of caste, community, and violence has often been told in South Asia as a history of sexuality, broadly construed, and Charu's work is an excellent example. For students of colonialism in South Asia, the history of violence under colonialism, the violence of caste, the violence of slavery, is quite central to how we have thought about sexuality. That the history of sexuality is about coercion as much as liberation, about the recuperation of histories of power as much as it is about the recuperation of sexual identities, is perhaps the first principle of the history of sexuality, even if one is thinking with Foucault. And about this last point, I'm sure many of you are familiar with Anjali Arundekar's work. And I think colonial India offers the rest of the world a very strong historiography to think with. And I'm thinking here of the diversity of interests covered as sexuality in South Asian history. So while we have Durba Ghosh's works, Sex and the Family in Colonial India, which offers an excellent account of the agency of indigenous women in sexual relationships with white men, despite their invisibilization in the archives, we also have Elizabeth Kolsky's work, which captures the ways in which the routine violence of racism and colonialism often came in the form of the forgotten instances of sexual torture. In my work, I try to reflect on why some of this work appears to be self-evidently about sex and others not. Both the routine and pervasive sexual and racial violence under colonialism, as well as the strategic use of sexualized alliances to enforce colonial domination, ought to be central to how we think about the history of sexuality. Charu's work, as I mentioned, is a great example of this, and my own recent work on sexology, especially on my work on what was termed Hindu sexology by its 20th century practitioners, is grounded in this understanding of sexuality as fundamentally encompassing the history of community, violence, and power writ large, and not only about individual sexual actions, identities, or experiences. So, what does South Asia bring to the history of sexuality? We write to step outside of the dominant frameworks that have given rise to history as a discipline, but also to the history of sexuality per se. The sexuality of South Asian history can and will provoke historians of sexuality towards a more generous and rigorous understanding of what constitutes the sexual, or so I hope. And I'm going to end right there and turn things over to Charu Gupta.
Thank you so much for that brilliant talk, Ishita. So I'll now invite Charu to come on and give her paper, which, let me get the title, is titled A Vernacular Archive of Sex and Sexuality.
Okay, a very warm thanks to Jessica and Tapsi for inviting me to this very, very fascinating discussions. And I really enjoyed the last conversation between Durba and Indrani. And it's so wonderful to see so many friends. I mean, I spotted Anjali, Durba, Swapna, Niti, Anindita, Geraldine, and so many others. So it's really wonderful to have so many of our, friends, comrades, and all of us who have celebrated, sexual pleasure in different ways. So it's wonderful to be here. So I'm going to share a PowerPoint. So bear with me for a minute. And okay. So as I reflect on my research on different subjects, the glue that holds them together is my constant attempt to reclaim fragmentary and marginal sexualities through which I weave social histories of early 20th century North India. And rather than cataclysmic events or extraordinary individuals, it has been histories of the everyday and the anecdotal which have been central to my work. So I posit here today three snapshots from my work which invite us to think about sexuality in South Asian history. First, my investment in the popular vernacular as a constitutive archive of sexuality in colonial South Asia. Second, the layered marking of sexuality of the other vis-a-vis religious and caste identities by Brahmanical patriarchies, be it the Muslim male, the Dalit, the prostitute, or the servant. And finally, the enactment of sexology from the margins through life narratives of women and Shudras, which ties to my new work. And these diverse registers of sexuality are tied as they are about marginal and subaltern sexualities as well as perceived perverse bodies. So I use records of incrimination reflected in the writings of upper caste Hindus and among British officials to reconstruct the sexual. So let me briefly discuss these issues to reflect on these entanglements between gender, sex, caste, religion, and the vernacular. So just hold on while it's, yeah. So my first snapshot. When I began my doctoral research in 1996, I was keen to explore the interface between Hindu nationalism, sexuality, and gender in early 20th century North India. What soon bothered me was that while the emergence of communalism had been highlighted by scholars, there had been little work done in stressing its linkages to sexuality. As I explored the conventional archival sources, I almost drew a blank, as most of the data on riots, large scale public violence, cow protection movements, and issue of music before mosques was in many ways blind to gender and sexual politics. However, I stumbled on a rich repertoire of vernacular sources in local libraries of Allahabad, Lucknow, Banaras, and Kanpur, and in the uncatalogued vernacular books in the British Library, materials that are often elided in archival research. Questioning the authority and authenticity of the official archive, and inspired in part by the intellectual provocations of Dalit and feminist studies, I not only point to erasures and silences in the archives, not only seek to read between the lines, and of course, Anjali's work has been brilliant in this arena, but I deploy the vernacular as my constitutive archive. So I explore everyday histories of sexuality in dialogue with other dominant texts and pervasive governmental configurations. So I have studied around 2,000 Hindi pamphlets, books, and various articles in magazines, and this wide popular print public sphere of early 20th century confirms the intricate relationship between intensification in the policing of sexuality, knowledge, and power in colonial India, which in turn worked insidiously to maintain the social order. So, for example, as I show in this slide, in canonized Hindi literature, there was a systematic attack launched against medieval Ritikal poetry and erotic descriptions of women. As I explored the intersections between everyday life, sex, sociality, and colonial power, I increasingly felt that while control over women's and men's sexuality was brought under greater prominence alongside modernity and colonialism, there were a rich variety of literary practices and complexities of cultural imagination that were also placing limits upon projections of respectability and homogeneity. There was no single code of Hindu middle class morality and no final triumph of sexual conservatism. After all, this was also a period when caste hierarchies and Hindu patriarchies were qualified. Reforms, the national movement, education, and women's presence in public arena signaled new opportunities for women, however limited they proved to be. Sexuality, pleasure, and love were expressed in diverse ways. Enhanced circulation of printed matter facilitated the widespread production of obscene or ashleel material as a commodity, and erotic consumerism became a part of the publishing boom. The vernacular became central to texts of sex and pleasure, creating a robust archive of sex, sexology, and sexuality. While a substantial part of this literature was against masturbation, multiple sex partners, and homosexuality, it also dealt in one way or another with sex and could be highly erotic. Weaving together sexual ethics, knowledge, and politics, they embraced a range of standpoints which reified and constructed sexual norms on the one hand, but also destabilized and questioned them on the other. So, a central endeavor of my work is to explore the voices and acts of transgressive sexualities and love, which precluded the crafting of a master narrative, and also how disorder crept into the moral order. So, in spite of increasing surveillance, expressions of sexuality not only survived but actually thrived in this period. Just to take an example, my work highlights how migration, growing loneliness, urbanization, and education may have led a section of women to seek solace in other relationships, particularly with their younger brother in law. Women may have found in such extramarital relationships a degree of solace to escape from everyday drudgery. So I looked at these whole range of cartoons, which show that these relationships were becoming common, and there was this repeated insistence on their prohibition, by juxtaposing the situation in the past and then in the present. So, attempts to control and censure sexualities, sexual identities, sex workers, certain languages, people, symbols, and cultures were made both by the colonial state and by the dominant castes, majority communities, and patriarchies. However, in many ways, these censorships failed, and in some ways, censorship was a failed enterprise. A second aspect of my work has been to reflect on how Brahmanical patriarchies and Hindu religious identities sought to censure Hindu women's sexualities while simultaneously demonizing the sexualities of the perceived others, be it the Muslim male, the Dalit woman, the widow, the prostitute, the servant, the homosexual. So I have shown how, with increasing hardening of religious identities, romance, and elopement involving Hindu women and Muslim men increasingly came to be depicted as abductions. In many ways, I'm amazed at the uncanny resemblances and contemporary resonances of this work with the recent mythical love jihad campaign in contemporary India. Two images that I have reflected on in my work and which were ubiquitous in the vernacular vocabulary and popular iconography of early 20th century were that of the lustful, lecherous, and sexually predatory Muslim male and the victimized, vulnerable, and foolish Hindu woman, which have had a long afterlife with significant shifts and additions. Denied the language of love, the specter of illegibility was marked as Muslim male then and in more ferocious ways today. Simultaneously, anxieties of who is bedding and wedding Hindu women were embedded in a distinct Hindu nationalism then and now. So Hindu women were either represented as foolish and frenzied or as victims of Muslim lustfulness, and Hindu community was asked to accept and control them. In the recent myth of love jihad too, Hindu women have been told in convoluted ways that interfaith romance is not only undesirable, but stopping it is good for women themselves. It is repeatedly stressed that the mere act of marrying a Muslim or converting to Islam ensures the unhappiness and a dreadful fate of the Hindu woman. This buttresses Hindu male power and dominance, which is couched in the language of protection. What my work, however, has also shown is that even amidst such censorships, elements of defiant love and sexual pleasure suggested a different order of rationality against efforts to categorize, classify, and project a homogenized community identity. My work proceeded to examine representations of Dalit sexualities in colonial pasts and contemporary presence, with Dalit women being constructed as vamps or victims on the one hand, and Viranganas and heroic women on the other. I begin by telling the story of how, in a section of didactic literature, Dalit women were recast through new forms and idioms into vamps and stigmatized bodies as unhygienic and lascivious. Their sexuality was perceived in binary opposition to the upper caste woman. The construction of woman in this literature had two sides. Upper caste was what woman ought to be. Dalit was what she had better not be. Negative descriptions of Dalit women were most visible in the case of Chamar, midwife. So, modernity, Western science, and medicine combined with social reform brought about new systems of surveillance around Dalit female reproductive technologies. The Chamar Dai was vilified as barbaric, dangerous, killer of children, witch, inherently dirty, vermin ridden, evil, and immoral. I also reflect on how, in a section of reformist literature, images of the permanently polluted, evil, and grotesque Dalit woman's body gave way to suffering figures redefined therein as victims deserving redemption. Simultaneously, contesting such representations through a multi-pronged critique of caste in the public sphere, in present-day popular Dalit writings, Dalit women like Jhalkari Bai, Uda Devi, and Mahabiri Devi have come to be marked as militant figures in the revolt of 1857. Myths, memories, and oral traditions transform the idea of archival historic authority and provide resistance to the disciplinary production of sexuality through a counter archive. So, such glorified representations of Dalit heroic women as desexualized entities disrupt stereotypes of sexually stigmatized Dalit women. Moral codes have a completely different balance here. The vernacular archive of conversions, especially by women on the margins, widows, Dalit women, prostitutes, can also be seen as an archive of desire. For example, conversions to Christianity, while signaling discourses of respectability and missions of domesticity, also opened opportunities for Dalit women. Clothing became an indicator to distinguish Dalit Christian women from their unconverted counterparts, which even came to be recognized in reformist literature. In the early 20th century, cartoons depicting the crisis of conversions through clothing entered the Hindi print public sphere, putting on display the perceived insecurities and sexual unease of reformist Hindus. Even while cataloging supposedly alarming results of Dalit women's conversions to Christianity, reformers could not help but acknowledge the change of demeanor and stature it brought about in Dalits, in their mode of dressing, walking style, gait, and prestige, with Dalit women carrying umbrellas and purses and wearing hats, skirts, and high heeled shoes. These banal communications are pivotal documents in conceiving the anxieties of Hindu reformers while also inadvertently offering a counter politics of sartorial desire. Individual conversions to Islam by some Hindu widows and Dalit women in colonial North India also reflect a language of love and romance. Such cases not only point to women's ambiguous relationship to caste and religious identities, they also show how conversions could be a mode of coping with and within limits, transgressing an oppressive social order. At the same time, the rule breaking by these women was seized as an opportunity to create an instrumental and temporary unity among Hindus. It is this contentious Hinduization at a moment of threatened conversion to either Christianity or Islam that rendered women's conversion precarious and courageous at the same time. My final snapshot. In my new work, amidst an efflorescence of vernacular sexology literature in early 20th century North India, I examine the heterosexual ethics in the writings of Yashoda Devi, a woman Ayurvedic specialist, and Santram B.A., a Shudra anti-caste Arya Samaj reformer who in different ways gave women a greater place in governing sexual life. While Devi questioned masculine sexual privileges, her writings often functioned within a reformist framework and reflected the limits of a Brahmanical Ayurvedic discourse. However, Santram's discourse displayed the possibilities of a Shudra anti caste perspective as he celebrated a utopian sexual future of man woman relationships, a better familial and social order, which supported free choice of multiple partners and sex before marriage. These minor and marginal figures enrich and complicate vernacular histories of sexology and open up a world of epistemic possibilities that could at times collude and at others defy the imperium of mainstream sexology. So, to conclude, this fragmentary feminist autobiography of sorts describes my personal journey and engagement with the vernacular archive of sex and sexuality in colonial North India. The discrete and disparate sites of my work provide different archival readings on sexuality and attempt to alter dominant historiographical conceits, moving from erotic and obscene literature to representations of Muslim sexualities, Dalit women, and sexology material. My vernacular archive is based on the anecdotal and the everyday, and is closely tied to the marginalized and the excluded in terms of subjects, themes, people, and actors. I draw largely on the print cultures of Brahmanical upper castes and in the process of interrogating them, draw connections between elite and subaltern sexualities, female desires, and reproduction. And I think in many ways complicate the histories of sexuality, not only in South Asia, but also in the way they are perceived across the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charu, for that talk. I think there's so many connections that I can already see around the vernacular and around sexual knowledge and sexology, sexual science, and so on. We have a few questions already coming in. Just first of all, Ishita, I've got a request for the books that you mentioned. So I don't know if you want to come on and just quickly mention them, or maybe we can put them in the chat for people. Maybe we'll put them in the chat. Okay. So we'll do that before we end off. So first of all, if I could ask, we've got a question from Devika. Could you come on to audio to ask your question?
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Professor Hinchy. Hi, can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
I'm so sorry. It's like 3 a.m. here. But yeah, thank you so much for that, Professor Gupta and Professor Pande. I've read both your texts as a part of my course, and it's such a delight to actually hear you, both of you, if not in person, at least virtually. So the question I had, and I really enjoyed the presentations, was that both of you in some ways talk about transgressive sexualities and marginalized sexualities, not just in the current presentations, but also your work in particular. Specifically, so the question that I wanted to ask is, and because it's something that I'm currently looking into, is where does childhood sexuality fit into this scenario? And the reason I'm asking this in particular with regards to South Asia is because, like Professor Pande's work, the whole idea of the girl child, right, who become child brides, or specifically with regards to feminist historiography that Professor Gupta engages in. So, and if you can point to any scholarship at all that actually talks about childhood sexuality in the case of South Asia, because so far I've hit quite the block when it comes to that. But yeah, thank you so much.
Well, Ishita's work is the classic example. You don't have to go anywhere else. I mean, it's all about childhood and sexuality. So, I'll leave that to Ishita. But of course, you can check the work of, Ruby Lal's work talks a little about it, and as does Tanika's work. So, but I'm sure Ishita, if you look at the bibliography of Ishita's new book, it will have just a whole set, a lot of readings on the subject. But I hand over the floor to Ishita.
Thanks, Charu. And I think maybe Devika, what you are trying to ask is your question more about the contemporary period and theorizations of child sexuality? Are you interested in literature on child sexual abuse, which perhaps makes the historical literature that Charu is citing about child brides in the early 20th century appear to you to not be about childhood sexuality in quite the same way, which perhaps is, which resonates with part of the point that I was trying to make in trying to think about the scholarship on child brides in the late 19th, early 20th century and theorize it with, by referencing sort of more contemporary notions of childhood sexuality or sort of theoretical takes on childhood sexuality that appear to us to be sort of divorced from the context of early 19th century India that historians have studied. So I'm wondering perhaps if the absence of the scholarship is sort of speaking to the point that I was trying to raise about a historiographical tradition that is not directly engaging the scholarship on sexuality when it comes to things like child marriage.
Yes, yeah, exactly that. But also simultaneously wanted to ask about, for example, the researches that you both are conducting at the moment. For example, Vernacular Archive of Sex and Sexuality. So where does, say, sexual desire, or for that matter, childhood agency when it comes to sexuality or pleasure fit into this in South Asian narratives and archives is what I'm also asking. Not just simply sources, but what you might have come across in your respective researches.
Charu, do you want to take that? I have.
Do you want to say something like, well, my work specifically does not address questions of childhood sexuality, but in some ways, there is this, I mean, if you look at somebody like Yashoda, who's a moral sexologist and who's like writing, huge amounts. I mean, she's the most read woman writer in early 20th century. Then what you come across here is a language, which is pervasive in this period, is a language of control. And there is this constant lament about how early childhood, marriages of, in early childhood lead to overt kind of expressions of sexuality. So there is sexual desire, and that needs to be controlled, and that is why the argument is constantly being made to raise the age of marriage. So I think there are these kind of fears and anxieties about sexualities that go beyond, say, the adult women, who are perceived. So it's the widow sexuality, the sexuality of the child, which creates these anxieties. And even if you look at the whole debate around child marriage, when the age of consent controversies, the argument that is being placed is very centrally this, that the sexual desires of young girls need to be controlled. And that is why they have to be channelized, and marriage is the way out. It has to be a monogamous relationship. That's the only way for sexual desire of these young girls to be streamlined. So there is this great anxiety about, I mean, there is this whole argument that women have 8 times more sexual desire than men. That is constantly being cited in the vernacular literature. But Ishita, you can.
Yeah. One of the works that I look at, and since you're asking about sources, is A.P. Pillai's work. A.P. Pillai, prominent sexologist, called Sex Knowledge for Girls and Adolescents. And that's a work that you might be interested in looking at, because he sort of does what Charu is talking about. He's addressing girls and he's addressing adolescents and addressing them very specifically on their sexuality, their sexual desires, describing or prescribing what, what is appropriate sexual behavior, um, instructing them on where attraction for, girls at school is within the realm of the permissible, and when it sort of starts crossing into perversion, etc. So, so there are sexological works in Hindi as well as in English that are addressed to girls and adolescents. And I guess part of what is interesting to me is therefore think about how sexuality and childhood are sort of co-constitute or constitute each other through the domain of sexology, right? So I would not necessarily classify these works as addressing the question of child sexuality as much as I think of these works as examples of um, works where you can see how um, ideas of childhood and sexual norms are being generated in dialogue with each other at this moment in the early 20th century. So I don't know if that answers your question directly, but yes, there are certainly examples of children and sexuality. If you are comfortable describing, say, 13 or 14-year-olds in the early 20th century as children, right? And where I would problematize that is to say that this is how children are being constituted as sort of as creatures to be protected from certain forms of sexuality.
All right, we've got a question from Anjali as well. Would you like to come on to the audio? Thanks.
I think I'm already on. Thank you so much, Ishita and Charu. What a wonderful way to wake up. And so my questions are in solidarity and sort of seeking more clarification, if you will, because obviously I've had the pleasure of reading everything you've written and learned an enormous amount of it. So I see a kind of paradoxical economy at work in both of your talks, and I want to sort of flesh it out a little bit. So let me start with Ishita. So I take very seriously your sort of summoning of, sexuality as a historiographical project within South Asian studies that has been sort of gone awry, if you will. Now, but what I wanted to hear more about, and that's where the paradox is for me, is that on the one hand, you're asking for a centering, but how do you center and de-exceptionalize? Which is precisely the project for someone like me who works out of queer sexuality studies, right? Where the idea has been precisely to move sexuality into a hermeneutic rather than to an object in the way in which Talal Asad would describe religion or Sabah would describe piety, right? The kind of discernibility of it is precisely what we want to move out of. So I was sort of wanted to hear a little bit more. What is at stake to center? What is the referent for that centering? And what are the methodological implications for it? And Charu, my question for you is similar. And I have learned so much from your work over the years, especially your archival work, but I've always wanted to know more about your use of the word vernacular. And vernacular for me is, again, sort of inhabits this paradoxical economy. It is a colonial phrase, right, which demarcates a kind of separation of epistemic and linguistic regimes. And you're sort of reclaiming it and centering it, but you're also insisting on its ordinariness. So I wanted to hear more about, I would say, in the book that I've just finished, I insist on using the word everyday and ordinary. But I feel as if we are doing some of the same work, though me with less grace. But and I have a lot of tension around the word vernacular, maybe because I work on Western India, where it has a different sense. So I'd like to hear more, because this exclusion, inclusion sort of tamasha that you are, sort of working through sits on this paradox, right? Of how do you bring in and de-exceptionalize? So I'd love to hear more from both of you about this. Thank you.
Thanks, Anjali. As with any question you've ever asked me, I need to think about this for 10 days, if not a lifetime, before I can come up with a satisfactory answer. But I can certainly take a stab at what's at stake for me. And I think partly what's at stake is, what I try to describe here as thinking about sex as a historiographical problem. And to me, then sex and sexuality becomes a way of talking about history writing as such, right? And to go back to and read, not to put sex back in, say, provincializing Europe, but to reflect on why we have continued to be able to think about history critically without um, recognizing how sexuality sort of pervades how we have thought about not just, history in the straight sense, but also history when thought about and written about and critiqued from sort of within post-colonial scholarship. And this, I fully understand, is not even a partial answer to the question you're asking. But I think that perhaps explains sort of, I think, a divergence perhaps in what is at stake for you and what is at stake for me to a certain extent, if that makes sense. Over to you, Charu.
Okay, fine. Okay, Anjali, as you're always so provocative and so wonderful to engage with, and it makes one, rethink one's own work and look at one's own, arguments. But what I would still say is that, since I attended this 3-day conference on the vernacular, which was a wonderful conference held recently by Jamia and Heidelberg together. It's all available on YouTube. But what I do think is that, people have problematized the use of the vernacular. People have talked of the terms like multilinguality. They've talked of Bhasha archives. They have talked of regional languages. But we also know that while this kind of, I prefer to use the word this because I think it encompasses a whole range of meanings, which this word carries within itself. And in spite of wavering colonial support, actually these publications thrived in this period and were sustained by this growth of publishing houses and presses and market forces in this period. And it was the vernaculars, that significantly contributed in expanding and commercializing the print market and also making sex available at, literature on sex available at a relatively lower cost. And it also paved way in many ways, it marginalized Sanskrit and Persian, and there was a democratization of languages along with standardization. And there has been so much of work. For example, so Sudipta Kaviraj says that perhaps vernacular critical thought, and even in terms of sex and sexuality, was more original and more intransigent towards Western reasoning than what appeared in English. Or the works of, recent works of S. Shankar, Uday Kumar, Rashmi Sadana, A.R. Venkatachalapati, they all have pointed out how, there is a kind of cultural history and literary historiography, which is there in the Bhasha archives. And I think these kind of Bhasha archives do not just offer a counter record, they do not just help in remaking or demolishing dominant archival and literary perceptions around sexuality. They not only make room for a more robust sexual history, but I think, again, to come to that point, that I think the non-vernacular archive more often than not records the extraordinary, the cataclysmic, the official. And I think the vernacular is a tactic of the everyday. And I think that is important. Also, I think it is not just a linguistic category. It is no particular notion that one can claim authority over or appropriate. I think there are multiplicities residing in a seemingly unitary vernacular. So I think it's an expansive term that encompasses not only bhasha sahitya, but is also a synonym for one's matri bhasha or mother tongue, which questions language hegemony of any kind, while endorsing a vernacular sensibility. So I think as a feminist scholar, as a scholar who works on issues of sex and sexuality, I think the practice and potential of employing the vernacular not just as an object of analysis, but as a critical methodology of the marginalized is important for me. I don't know if I've answered your question, but yeah.
Charu, I was going to write that down, and now I have to ask you ask a question. Critical methodology of the margins, I think, was that it? So we have a question now from Aprajita, who has a question about technologies. Yeah. And I think from now on we might take a bit of time just so we can get through get through some more questions. So after that, I'll ask Fidelity to come on and ask.
Thanks. My question is really short. It's about technologies and technologies of self, and how does that implicate all the debates, or sorry, all our discussion happening here. For instance, is there a way of demarcating procreative sex and sex for pleasure, and therefore immoral or illegal sex through technologies, through use or use of condom, or for other, the condom enters pretty late in the discussion, I know, but in late colonial India, what is the way in which technology is implicated in this discussion of what is the right age to have sex and whether you can have sex outside marriage? Thanks.
Thanks so much. I'll just ask Fidelity to come on and ask her question, and then you guys can respond to both of them.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
So I guess my question is adding on to the earlier question on childhood sexuality. From my honors thesis, which I'm working under Professor Hinchy for, I realized that most of the scholarship on childhood sexuality has been focused on girlhood. So I wonder what the speakers have come across in relation to boyhood with regards to child sexuality.
Right. Who wants to go first responding to those questions? Maybe
stab at it, and then so Aparajita, thank you for your question. Everything I know about condoms I learned from you, so that's so it's interesting that you are asking me this question. So Aparajita has written a brilliant dissertation on population control, and she has a chapter on condoms and technologies of birth control. And I think partly that's where the question is coming from. So I think that I think I'll leave this for another conversation, because as I said, my thinking on condoms has been shaped a lot by the chapter that you wrote in your dissertation. So I'll take Fidelity's question on boys and the absence of boys when it comes to discussions of childhood sexuality, especially in the context of early 20th century India. That's a question that I have explicitly tackled in my recent book, where so partly what the centering of sexuality does to debates about child marriage is what it does make visible, I think, in a new way, is the figure of the boy child as a sexualized sort of figure, who actually loomed very large in the discussions on child marriage in the early 20th century, and in a way that we've lost sight of as child marriage has become reconstituted for us as a problem of social reform and of women's rights, etc., and therefore has become focused on issues of gender and on women and the girl child and so on. So so there is, and Charu has written about this as well, there is a vast sort of literature, reformist literature, as well as sexological literature addressing boys and boys' sexuality. And a lot of the child marriage literature produced in the early 20th century is actually more concerned about the preservation of the sexual strength of boys than it is about preserving the innocence or sexual purity of girls. And what is interesting, I think, in centering sexuality is to, again, bring to sight those other concerns that we have lost sight of as things like child marriage have become redefined as a particular type of problem, which is sort of a women's rights or the rights of the girl child type of issue, in a way that it was not in the early 19th and early 20th century. So in my book, I've written briefly about novels that were focused obsessively on the sexual sort of debility caused for young boys by being forced into marriages, and by being forced to sort of perform sexually by women in the family, usually sort of older women, etc. So there is so yes, the again, the absence of the boy is, I think, an issue that needs to be tackled again historiographically, because the archives are actually full of boys and concerns about their sexuality.
Okay. Okay. I'll also try to answer this to the best of my ability. So as far as technology question is concerned, what I see is that the various sexologists who are writing in this period, self-proclaimed ones, those who are, what Ishita has called the flourishing of Hindu sexology in this period, and a large amount of literature around sexology that's coming out, in the early 20th century. What you see is that while they are promoting, sex reform and attempting to govern the collective sexual life of the nation, they are really, many of these texts, while drawing inspiration from, the so-called, erotic kind of shastric literature, the Sanskrit classics, they are also saying that they are inspired from biomedical sexology, a hedonistic consumer culture, and new technologies that are available. So many of them are using graphic visuals, for example, of male and female reproductive anatomy. Santram, for example, constantly talks about technologies of, birth control and shows graphic visuals of that. So technology is harnessed at times, by these sexologists to, govern in many ways the sexual life of the nation, and for very different messages. So, for example, the two protagonists that I'm working on, Santram uses technology to encourage more sex, while Yashoda Devi uses it to discourage sex, as a kind of moral sexologist. Coming to the question of male sexuality, actually, I would argue just the reverse of what you're saying. It's much more talked about, what Ishita was saying, than female sexuality. There is an obsession with brahmacharya and celibacy. So there is this constant talk about how young boys should not, sit on hard beds, what they should eat, how they should move around, how, the whole kind of Gurukul literature is just filled with instructions to young boys. So there is, and on the other hand, if you read somebody like Pande and Sharma, Ugra, when he's talking of sodomy, he's constantly referring to these young boys, who are called pocketbook, chocolate, money order, and these young, beautiful boys, who he says are so much, there in UP, and there are so many cases of sodomy, going on. So there is, I think, quite an obsession. I mean, manhood emerges as a national preoccupation in colonial India. Gandhi is obsessing about it, and Gare Samaj is obsessing about it. Sanatan Dharmis are writing about it. And the figure of the young boy becomes very, very central to that. So I think that needs to be taken into.
All right, great. So next up, I'm going to ask, sorry, just looking at my list, Ruksa to ask her question. Yeah. Oh, sorry, Ruksha, I wrote your name down.
Yeah, thank you, Jessica. Thank you very much, both of you, for the amazing talk. My question is actually to both of you, Professor Charu and Professor Ishita. So I was wondering, since both of your works are based on intersections on Hindu nationalism, gender, sexuality, caste, and religion in relation to transgressive sexualities and stigmatized sexual identities, especially in the work of by Charu Gupta. So it makes me wonder about my own work on trans communities based in India, especially for instance a community like Hijra, whose everyday experiences are caught amidst caste and religion, and not to mention the rising Hindu upper class nationalism within the community to make themselves legible. I wanted to ask, where would a young Hijra who joins the community in their teen would be placed in this discussion of child sexuality in your works? Is there a space for that? And because it's something which is different from a young girl's sexual desires, and I also feel there is an obvious lack of scholarship that looks at Hijra child sexuality. And I have like two questions. So my second question is for Professor Charu. If she and I just wanted to ask if she found any cartoon or sketch based work on sexual minorities when she was looking into her own research. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Charu, would you like to go first, maybe?
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think Jessica is the best person to talk about hijras, and I do think that it's an arena which needs to be explored further, especially in the colonial context. As historians, we really value Jessica's book because we really think that this. I think that this is the first of its kind. Because you have other works, Reddy's work, or there are other works which are talking about the contemporary context. Or this very interesting scholar from Bangladesh. The name is slipping. What is his name? Jessica would know, who's written extensively on hijras, and he talks about about male child, as sexualities. Hijras who young boys who enter into hijrahood. So I think it's so difficult to get stuck on hijras itself in the colonial period, and then to talk in that also about childhood sexuality among hijras and how it was expressed, especially in the colonial period. It's the archive that poses very constraints to us. So, for example, the kind of material that Jessica looked at, the records where they were criminalized, largely pertains to a particular kind of age group of hijras. So, and of course, they were seen as child kidnappers. That was constantly there, that they are the ones who are kidnapping children. So, and about sexual minorities, of course, in the contemporary context, you see all kinds of cartoons, talking about the overt sexuality of the Muslim male. So there is a lot of cartoons around the overtly sexualized figure of the Muslim male. That is very much visible, in the way in which he dresses, the way he looks, the way he, so for example, one of the cartoons that I showed, where there is this Muslim man with the beard and with heart shaped kind of, in his eyes, and beard is also shaped in the shape of a heart. So there is this overtly, sexualized representation of the Muslim male that is really prevalent in social media that you see. As far as the Muslim woman is concerned, you see another kind of imagery which came out in the whole triple talaq debate in India, and in the that how the Muslim woman's sexuality is suppressed. So it is represented as the suppressed sexuality, as a suppressed femalehood by the majority community. So there is the Muslim woman's sexuality in some ways has to be protected and preserved by the Hindu male from the Muslim male. So there is this kind of an argument, just as it's the Hindu male burden at present, to rescue in some ways the Muslim woman, which is extremely problematic.
Ishita, did you want to respond to this question?
Yeah, just very briefly, I think I'm just reiterating partly where Charu was going. In terms of the representations of the Muslim male in a lot of, a lot of the work that I'm reading, which is similar to what Charu has read and is reading as well, the representations of Muslim male as sodomite, representations of the Muslim male as abusing children also became very prevalent in the context of the child marriage debates in the 20s and 30s. What I have not come across, and I will completely concede it could be from because of the fact that I was not addressing the specific question that you're asking, which is about what about the figure of the Hijra child or the young Hijra person, right? I mean, I do not actually have an answer to that question, and that's again because of perhaps not having looked hard enough and not having asked the right questions of some of the sources.
Yeah, I might just, if I could take the liberty of just adding on to that. I mean, I think too, and this is part of what Ishita's work does so, just so fantastically, is to make us think about age, I think, as a category, or maybe like a question of analysis that requires historicization in the history of sexuality, and with regard to the archives that we have of histories of the Hijra community as well, because of course, like, who is a child became a question that I was having to remind myself of all the time when reading those archives, because the child is so moralized by both sort of like North Indian, relatively elite sort of male commentators and by colonial officials too. So that makes the historical work, I think, quite challenging in some ways. And I think too, thinking about like binary concepts of gender and how they are in our archives, and it's quite difficult to, I mean, I have this question, right, of how we implicitly work with the sort of very binary understanding of gender that may not actually work with the sources that we're reading all the time too. Like, this is sort of an auto critique even to myself too. We've only got a few more questions and a few more minutes left, and we've also got some reading sort of recommendations and so on in the chat that I'll be sure to relay to you guys. But I'm just wondering if Kamash would like to come on audio.
Swapna has also raised her hand, Hinchy. So Swapna has also raised her hand. So maybe we can have 3-4 questions together, and then we can so that people can please post questions.
Sure. What do you want to go, Swapna? Sorry, I didn't see that your hand was raised. You're on mute at the moment. Do you want to unmute and ask, and then I'll wait for Kamash to get back to me.
Thank you, Charu and Ishita, for this brilliant talk. As you know, I follow both of your works with avid interest. So actually, I raised my hand a bit earlier when there was this question. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. When there were a lot of questions around child sexuality, and particularly that of a boy child, what it reminded me of is Ishita's earlier work, where she has, your first book, where you talk about the boy child as a masturbator. Remember, in the context of child being the male child, in the context of the trope of degeneration, if I remember it correctly. So that was another prevalent trope which was found in a different kind of literature. So, and that definitely sexualized the boy child. The question of agency, however, we are not sure, because we are not sure uh, who were writing about them. There was not one uh, uh, individual who was commenting about that. Kind of, it was described as a national epidemic, the boy child as a masturbator, and Ishita has expanded on that. So I just wanted to remind you of that. And since all three of you are here, Charu, Ishita, and Durba Mitra, I was wondering, how do you see the intersection of your works? Because I see a lot of intersection in them, but I would like to hear from the authors on how you see each other's works in conjunction with one another. Because, well, I don't want to take too much time. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question.
You can take some more questions, Jessica, and then answer together.
Sure, we can do. I think maybe one of the question askers has dropped out. But we had a question about different approaches to sexuality that we might find in the data literature. So like Piru and Love Legends of Hiranja by Wada Shah. And so, you know, different modes of control in Punjab in popular literature. And also writings of Krishna Shakti as well. And so I think thinking with the vernacular again about like other modes of literature. I mean, I know, Charu, you're working with Hindi literature and Ishita largely with Bengali literature, I think, but there are different approaches to sexuality in various literatures. And we've also had some recommendations of places where we find discussions of the vernacular. So Mobeen Hossein has pointed out that Eugenia Lean has contended with the term vernacular in the early 20th century in China as a term encompassing language and everyday practice in vernacular. So would you guys like to respond to that mix of ideas?
Excuse me, ma'am.
Excuse me, ma'am.
Excuse me, ma'am. Please consider my question that is in chat box.
Sorry, would you like to read out your question? Sorry if I've missed you. I'm trying to find.
Okay, I have said to that. Basically, in the North India, many people consider homosexuality and other sex as a societal curse because they say that it is not mentioned as Sanatan Dharma. Is it true or not? If true or not, how? If true, how to overcome from this?
Okay.
Ma'am, I am audible?
Yes, you are. Yes, you are. Thank you for that question. So I think we've got a few questions for you guys to deal with. So who would like to go first?
Ishita, would you like to go first, or?
You can go ahead. I can wait.
Okay. So, I'll just begin with what Swapna was asking. So I mean, I think there is this group of us, who are all constantly, we have this mutual admiration society. We are always quoting each other and we are drawing from each other's work, because I think in many ways it is not contradictory to each other, but it really enriches we enrich our work by referring to other works, and our works really speak to each other. So, for example, I recently, Durba's book, for example, the way in which he brings some new depths and insights into sexuality studies, where she refers to the prostitute not just as a figure in a category but a concept. And I think that she makes that the primary grid to foundationally think and write about modern Indian society and the making of disciplinary knowledge. And I think, this looking at, the question, the figure of the, not just the figure of the prostitute, but, in many ways, looking at the way in which the other was constituted, in the colonial period, again, as a conceptual category, as a conceptual tool, I think really can bring that brings new freshness, intensity, and academic depth, I think, to our work. So and again, the way in which Ishita's new work, or for example Anjali Arundika's new work, which I just adore, which is on the Gomantak Samaj, and the way in which women there were making their voices heard in different ways. I think we really speak to each other. I think the way in which I would see my work contributing there, to some extent, is that I think that, while I think there is this need to bring the kind of oppressive vigilance of male sexuality also into our discourses, like not just the way in which female sexuality was brought under greater surveillance, and that ties to some of the questions on masturbation, as well as the way in which the condemnation of the queer, which is also very, very important, and it's precisely what we see. While the condemnation of masturbation was there in a large amount of literature around brahmacharya and celibacy that was there, that was published in this period, in some of it, you don't find that kind of criminalization of masturbation as is taking place in the West. So in many ways, there is this kind of language of condemnation, but not that kind of Foucauldian kind of criminalization, to that large extent. And I think what is also important, I think, is that we point to, I mean, for me, while, this idea of, greater surveillance, which Gurba's work talks about very effectively, how there is a kind of elite male perspective that dominates. But I think along with this position of negation, I think there were also it's important to see the cracks, the fissures, the subversions and deviances against disciplinary power regimes, which I think it is by seeing both these things, the increasing surveillance and the kind of fissures that were created, that I think this kind of, we can enrich the global history of sexuality. And I think each of us, in a different ways, in small ways, are attempting to do that. About the question on that, I mean, Kamlesh Mohan's question, she herself has done such rich work, on the subject, and I'm sure, she's the one, who can, for example, Anshu Malhotra's work on Piru, where she talks about how there was this kind of blurring of religious identities, is very important, which brings another angle to the way in which we look at sexuality studies. So I'll stop there.
Sorry, Ishita, would you like to respond?
Yeah, if I could just again respond very briefly to Shopna, your question about the resonances between various works, which obviously emerges from us very scrupulously reading and being inspired by each other. Dhruva's recent book, for instance, is sort of completely relevant to, I think, even the way I was presenting my own work today. Dhruva's work, Indian Sex Life, for instance, as you might have read, points out how the figure of deviant sexuality was, and which she sort of focused on the figure of the prostitute, was so crucial to the very conceptualization of the social sciences. And I think what I'm doing is basically make that argument, but make it about feminist historiography. So I think that's where I'm sort of taking the critique of social sciences and how sexuality is seen there, and I think what I'm doing in my book is taking some more recent feminist historiography as also making similar claims and thinking of the figure of the child wife in an almost analogous way. And therefore, I think to me, what is interesting is to take sexuality and turn it into a form of self-critique for us as feminist scholars, I think, instead of sort of looking back and finding the sources of criticism or the objects of criticism elsewhere, but to turn the gaze on ourselves and how we've thought of some of these problems, and to think about how these social scientific categories or juridical categories actually continue to pervade whether, even the more critical scholarship that we have continued to produce in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. So absolutely, there's a resonance there. And again, with Charu, and Charu, Durba, and I actually appear together in this special issue on the history of sexology that I briefly mentioned. And Anjali certainly was a very important interlocutor for us in producing those essays. And I think all of us do think about the vernacular, the three of us think about the vernacular, but we also think about the vernacular in somewhat different ways. And I think I try to get to some of that in my introduction to that volume, where I try to problematize the distinction that we often make in terms of the binaries between when we think of the vernacular, the everyday, etc., and then we think of whatever the opposite of vernacular is, whether it's the classical or so, and so on. And then I try to posit the question of English as the vernacular and what it does to forms of colonial classification that seem to pervade sort of more descriptive understandings of the vernacular, and to therefore sort of take the vernacular as a problem. And of course, Charu does that in her own different way. And Durba's essay is very critical of the use of the term vernacular and how it sort of signifies in certain ways. So I think we learn from each other, but we learn more by sort of disagreeing sometimes and debating each other as well, as we think about sexuality together and with each other, but also sort of apart from each other sometimes.
I think that's a good note to end this conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much to both Ishita and Charu for joining us today. And once again, I mean, this second installment has just given us so much to think about. I've got pages of notes and questions. There were a few questions that were in and pointers and stuff in the chat. So if we didn't get to your question, I'm going to definitely screenshot the chat and pass that on to Charu and Ishita.
And write to us. Please feel free to write to me. I mean, I can share my email, in the chat box. And
that would be fantastic. Yeah. Thank you so much. So I think we're going to have to leave it here, but if we could all just give a round of applause to our speakers for today. And thank you so much for joining us in the NTU History Seminar.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having us. Thank you. And it's great to see all the friends.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Jessica. Thanks, Tapsi, for doing
Thanks,
a fantastic job. And thanks, everyone. Yeah.
Thanks, Ishita. Good night.
Thanks. Thanks so much. Bye.
Or morning, as the case might be. Okay, so I'm going to screenshot this.
Oh, I have the text, Jess. You don't have to it'll come in the report, and I'll send this on to Charu and Ishita, and I'll also sort of send you guys details about other stuff shortly. But thank you both so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for organizing this, and thank you everyone for coming.
Thanks. Bye.
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 Bye, Charu.
Bye, Charu. Is Charu still? Oh, I think she's gone.
I'm going to end now. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Bye.
Wait, okay.